Today, we are going to talk about recording macros and also some VBA basics. We are going to move from doing things manually in Excel to telling Excel to do them for us. Okay. We'll start by recording macro at the end, where I will explain to you how to do that. Then we will open the VBA editor to see the code in Excel that have been generated. Okay. After that, we will learn how to improve recorded code so it becomes a little bit smarter. It can handles like any number of rows. You might write a code and record a macro and write a certain and the VBA editor edit it for you. The VBA editor provides you the code that has been written based on what you have been doing in the worksheet, but you might have to adapt that code to make it something that is more general. It can make decisions using if statement. It can repeat actions using loops. So by the end, you should be able to automate a repetitive task safely and confidently. All right, that's what I expect you to do. So before we get any further, let's try to get into what we want to do by the end of this lecture. The learning outcomes is very clear. You want to record a macro to automate a repetitive task. You want to open the VBA editor and locate your recorded macro. You want to understand the VBA basics like procedures, which are blocks of code, which is a block of codes. You have variables which represent the named storage boxes, and you have the idea of an object which refers to workbook, worksheet, range. All these are what we refer to an object. I'm going to discuss that further. And then we are going to modify recorded macros that we have so that it works for any dataset length, for example, not just on a fixed range when you are recording a macro. And then we are going to use if and loops to apply simple rules automatically. And obviously, we will save the correctly as a xlsm, sorry, and run the macro safely, right? That's what we want to do. Now let's define what a macro actually is in very plain terms. Okay, a macro, a macro, what it is simply a set of steps that Excel can repeat for you. That's all it is. It's a set of steps that Excel can repeat for you. If you always do the same task, format columns, add headers, compute totals, highlight values, um, a macro can turn that into one simple click. Those things like formatting, what you are usually do, a macro can do that in a single click. So it's just like you just do control a shortcut key, for example, and you can get the macro to do all this for you in a matter of seconds rather than you going and doing it one by one. So why do you want to use it? You want to use it for different purposes, like for speed. Normally, repetitive work becomes instant when you are doing it. You want it to be done for consistency purposes. The same step happens the same way each time. And you want to have fewer mistakes where you have less manual clicking going on. Okay. So now the important point that you have to understand is that when you record a macro, Excel stores it as a VBA code. It stores it as a VBA code inside the workbook. Okay, VBA stands for Visual Basics for Application, and it lets you go beyond recording by adding logic. It helps you go beyond the recording. Like you see, if you are recording what you are doing in Excel, that's good, but data is not always the same. Sometimes your data might increase in length, data might decrease in length, things get dynamic, and it's not good that you keep on using the same recorded macro for other data. So even if your data itself, you find that there is a row that is missing and you add an additional row, if you use the recorded macro, that recorded macro will not take into account this additional row, or more interest in it may fail, right? So then you might have to add logics like if statement, if something is missing, do this. you can add for loop, that is for every row that you have, do that. Okay, that's the advantage that you have. So you can add logic, you can do looping, you can create custom rules. All these are things that you can do using macros. But before we start automating anything, we must talk a bit about the safety and file types, because macros change files. Okay, now, two critical rule that you have to bear in mind when you are doing when you're talking about macro safety and file types. There is the first thing is the .xlsm. All right, this is what we call macro enabled workbooks. All right, this is what we call the macro enabled workbook. It's where macros are kept. It's where macros are kept. That's what it is. Then you have this XLSX. It's your normal workbook. So there, XLSS. That is so X. Sorry, this is your normal workbook. It's your normal workbook. Um, Here, you have to be careful. It's not where you want the macro to be saved. All right, you want the macro to be something general that you can apply on any workbook. By the way, so the if you save your file in the end as .xlsx, what would happen is that the macro that you have created on that workbook will be removed. The macro that you have created will be removed. So it is important that you save your macros as .xlsm. So if you record a macro and then save as XLS, your macro is gone. I repeat it, ensure that you save as XLSM. Okay. The second rule that you have to bear in mind here is that um, only enable macros from trusted sources. So if you have a file some days that is given to you from someone in an organization, or somebody send you an Excel file with macros enabled there, be careful, ensure that you are opening it from trusted sources, just so that, because why? Because macros can automate tasks, but they can also be used to do harmful things if the file is untrusted. Okay, so in real workspaces, you often keep a backup copy before running any macro on important data. Okay, just ensure that whenever you are running a macro, before you get into doing the macro, you always have your file saved somewhere. Because if your original file, before applying the macro, is not saved somewhere, and your macro has got some errors or mistakes, it might be you won't be able to do the undo button. All right, that's what I mean. You won't be able to do undo to get back to what it was before. So ensure that, because the macros generally have several steps involved. So if you try to create undo, it won't work. So ensure that you still have your original file before applying any macro. Now, where are macros stored? So you have macros can be stored in this workbook. Macros can be stored in this workbook, so macros stays inside the file. It's good for sharing with someone else. All right, that's what we refer to as portable workbook. Macros, it's portable. But you also have personal macros workbook, which is on your computer only. So this macro, what we call personal macro workbook, is a macro that is stored on your computer only. It's good for your own shortcuts. Okay, but we are not necessarily going to use personal macro workbook. We are going to save macros using this workbook. All right, now what we are going to do is the practical clicking sequence on how to record a macro in Excel. Here we go. Normally I'll demonstrate that, and then you'll repeat it. All right, let me just open an Excel file. Just give me a second with you. So we have an Excel file which is open. So you are going to just repeat what I'm going to do here. You can try it on how to get started with the macro. First of all, you see there is this developer tab here, that where you get access to the macro. You also have this possibility of having the macro through the view function for some of you. But still, I will go through the developer tab just to give you the general way in which macros are run. Okay. Though if you have access to the view tab, that should have been sufficient. But still, I'm just going to show you that. First of all, for some of you, you may not have access to this developer tab. You might say, where is this? I'm not seeing it. It's okay. If you don't see it, I'll explain to you how you get access to that. First of all, you click on File, and then you click on Options. When you click on File, you click on Options down there. You will see that there is, where is this? Customize ribbon, right? You click on Customize ribbon, and then you go down there in the main tab. You go and identify developer. Normally, if you don't have it installed there, it will be like that. It will be unticked. So what you would have to do is to tick it and you click OK. For me, I already have it. There's no need for me to do that. You will click OK. Then you will see it appear as part of a ribbon here as you are seeing. Next is that now when this is there, you can record your macro. As I said to you, this was not necessary, but still it's one way of doing things where you can also click here and record your macro. But let me go through the developer tab to record the macro. You will see that there is a button here called record macro. So you can click on that button record macro and then you give it a name. For example, I can call it format row header. That is the name. I want to format the row header. Okay, so how do I do? Remember, when you are putting the name of a macro, this you have to bear in mind. No spaces. Do not put something like that, please. Do not put something like that. Remove all spaces when you are giving a macro name. Why don't we want spaces? Because VBA treats the macro name like an identifier, and spaces will cause problem. Be careful with that. Okay, so you want to store the macro with a particular name. Optional, you can create a shortcut key if you want. Let's suppose I call it shortcut A, Control A. Each time I'm going to type Control A, I'm going to get the macro running. Okay, so you will remember I mentioned to you there is a personal macro and then there is this workbook. So what I want you to do is to save in this workbook itself, forget the personal macro, and then you click OK. There you are going to record your macro based on that name. You click OK. And then you start deciding what you want your macro to do. For example, let's suppose I want my macro to uh, select the first columns A to J, and then I want to format it by putting how do we say, a color. Suppose I want to put it as yellow, and I want to change it to blue, for example, the font size to blue. Let's suppose so that when I'm going to write, it is going to write in blue, or I can keep it as black as well. It doesn't matter. And then I want it to be I want to freeze pane. View, freeze pane, for example. You freeze the top row. These are the different things that you can do. But when I'm scrolling down, it doesn't change anything. So I'm recording the macro. And when you're recording the macro, avoid doing anything that you don't want it to do. All right. Stick to the minimum um, manipulation within your macro so that you don't get unwanted things within the codes that makes it hard for you to remove, etc., and modify. So stick to exactly what you want to do and don't do anything else apart from that in within that sheet, please. So here what I'm doing is that I'm recording the macro. So when I've recorded the macro, I will go back here. Where is it? I'm going to go to developer and then I will say stop recording. Okay. Where I will say stop recording. So I've decided what I want to do. I will say stop recording. For example, by the way, before I get into that, let me just do something else. I want it to be underline as well, and I want it to be bold as well. So I can do all these things all at once. I can underline, not underline. I want to have a bottom border, all right, and I also want it to be bold. All these I can do within the macro. Then when I'm done with that, what is happening here behind the scene is that Excel is recording my clicks. Okay. And then what I can do, I will do go to developer and I say stop recording. When I say stop recording now, for those who have 365, you will get something like that. Okay, you can save the script it's, if you want, but it will give you something that is not necessarily uh, exactly what VBA is about. Okay, the codes that is in the script is a little bit different from VBA, but it will do the work as it is doing in the VBA. So you might want to run it in a different sheet that as it is, or you can just, so that I don't confuse you, I would suggest that we close this editor here. Close this recorded action. You can play with it afterward if you want, after you have understood the VBA. But right now, I would suggest that you close that and we proceed with what I'm explaining. So then when you have clicked stop recording, you will see that there is record macro again now. What are you going to do? You want to run that macro again. You remember that you have put, how do we say? You have put a shortcut to the macro. You can click a new sheet and apply that shortcut. When you apply that shortcut, you will do Control A. And when you do Control A, you will see that this shortcut is as has been automatically executed. For example, if I write something, I expect that first of all, there is this bottom border as you are seeing. When I'm scrolling down, the freeze pane is here. And when I write something, it is supposed to be blue and bold as you are seeing. You see, these are the different things that you can do within that worksheet. And you can keep on doing that for each worksheet, especially if this is a repetitive task that you need to do for different tables. You can easily do that as you observe here. Now, the other thing is that instead of clicking through the shortcut, let's suppose you did not create the shortcut, you could create a new worksheet and you will do something like that. Okay, you can do, you can click on the macro here if you want, or you can do Alt F8. You click on the macro, you do Alt F8, and then you choose the macro, especially if you have written different macro. One is to format row header, one to do everything. So it depends. Whatever you want to do, you can you have several macros. You can run each macro one at a time if you want. Okay, so then when you get this small pop-up here, what you just need to do is to click on run. Okay, when you click on run, you will see it execute the macro. So that's one way of doing it, or as I told you, you can just run the shortcut. I create a new sheet again. I will do the same thing now. I will do Alt F8 to bring up the macro, and you will see that there is this possibility of creating, clicking on edit. Okay, you can click on edit. You will see that now when you have clicked on edit, you will get something like that. This is our VBA code. I will come back to that in a moment. But instead of going and clicking on edit, etc., you can also do in the worksheet Alt F11. Alt F11 brings that worksheet as it is. Not the worksheet, but brings the macro as it is, the codes that have been run, okay, as you are observing here. There are quite a number of things that you don't need to know necessarily, but you will need to identify what are those things that are of interest to me. For example, there are certain things that you would prefer just to leave as it is, but let's suppose you want to improve that macro. You can play around with this. For example, if you want the header, you know that there is an additional column that will be involved. For example, instead of J, I want K to be involved. So if you want K to be involved, you just need to amend that K, for example. You see, these are the different things that you can do. When you have a macro, you can improve that macro just to adapt to your new data that you have. Okay. Now, the other thing that I want to tell you here is, as I mentioned to you, you can view, you can click view. If you don't get access to this developer tab, you still don't have access to it, you can click on view, you will still have access to the macro here. You can click on view macros, you can click on edit, by the way, instead of Alt F11, as I mentioned, you can click on edit, you will get access to that macro. Now, here you will see that it is in the modules that the macro is written. You see, it's in the modules. You can have different worksheet or whatever it is here. These are the different objects, but it doesn't matter. What matters here is especially this part, module 1, module 2, module 3, where the macros are written. For example, the first module is here where the macro is written. Let me just do a small improvement. Let's suppose I want to amend that to highlight up to O. You see, I want to amend this formatting up to O because I know that there are additional columns coming in. So what I can just do, I modify that. I put it as O, excuse me, ensure that you don't put anything else and you write it properly, please. So you need to write O1, okay? So what do I want? Or even at P, let me just put it P so that you see it well. So A1 to P, so I just need to modify that code and save it. All right. Now, when you are saving it, you remember I mentioned to you Excel enable macro. You can give it a name. I will go and save it somewhere. Lecture 4. I will give it a name, format row header. Format row header. Okay, format row header. I'll save it as XLSM, not XLS. I save, click save, and I'll get access to this macro which has been saved as format XLSM. So what do you want now is I want to what? Uh, I've modified that and I want to execute that now. So if I want to execute that, I come in sheet 4 here, and then I will run the macro. You can click on run here, by the way, if this is already open to you, or you can do what I've explained to you earlier, and you can click execute, and you see that now it has changed to from A to P. And you can also see that if you type something here, you type LI or whatever it is, you will see that it appears as blue and bold. And again, there is the formatting which is up to P. Now, this formatting which is up to P, you might say that the line is here. So up to P, you have a formatting. But I think, sorry, I think when I did the formatting of the top border, what I was doing earlier was to select the all first row and I click on that. Okay. So this is why I'm getting the how do we say, the formatting of a border for every columns, right? Otherwise, it would have stopped here if I decided to stop it there. Okay, here we go. You have an idea and an overview of what a macro is. You can imagine how fast it makes things life. It makes life for you. How fast and easy it is. It makes life for you. Okay, because here you have the ability to format a header each time without going and doing it each time yourself and clicking here. You click here and then you do that and then you do bold and then you do this. You don't need to do all that. The moment that you have done it once, and if you know that this has to be repeated task each and every time, you just need to do this macro to do it and record it for you. It's good that I've saved the macro, but what about when I want to, let's suppose here you will see that the macro has been saved as format row header dot xlsm. What about if I have a new file where I want to apply that macro on it? So I will have a file, trial file XLS. I'll open that trial file XLS and I will show you how we can apply that macro on any other file that you have. Okay. So you have your macro saved somewhere. Now, if you want to apply it on different file, you have the ability of doing that. Let me explain it to you. Let's suppose here I've got a column, a set of columns. Of course, I've done it up to P, but just for the sake of time, I'm not going to take long just writing a set of variables here. But let's suppose I've got these columns, and let's suppose you add a set of other names here. What are we going to do? Maybe I will just put it as J H T Y P just to complete that. Whatever. I give different names, yeah, up to P. Now, these are the different names of variables in the data, and I want to apply that macro. Number one, I need to open the XLSM file. That's the first step. Open the XLS file that you have already run. Okay, you minimize it somewhere, and then you will click on developer, and then you click on macros as you are used to, and then you will just need to find down there the file that has been opened, for example format row header.xls, and you click on that and you will get access to this. Okay, normally you won't get access to it unless you click on it. You will see that this will appear. So I repeat, this normally you will get something like let me so what happened is that when you are opening this target file, that is a trial file, you will see that when you click on open books, you will have this workbook trial file and you will have format row header. So you click on format row header, you will get something a bit like that. You just highlight it, you click on that, and then you will just need to click on run. That's all, as simple as that. You click on run, automatically it applies it for you. Now, this is where you have applied your file, and you may not want the macro to be saved there. You can just do file, save as, and then when you do file, save as, you keep it as XLS X. Don't put it as XLSM. You save your file as XLSM, you close that file, and then if you want to open it again, you can just double click and open it again, and you will see that the file is saved automatically. Just give me a second. Here we go. It does not contain any macros, but the macro has been applied. Just bear that in mind. If you want to do that, you will need to open the file, because if I don't open the file, I will not have access to the code. For example, let's suppose I close that and I come and do the same thing I wanted to do. I do developer, I do macros, and then I click here. You will see that this won't appear. So you need to open the macros first to be able to execute that. That's a very simple way of doing it for information. Okay. Now, the next step is you need to understand that recording macro is very easy. Yeah? It's very easy, but editing it is a different story. All right. When you record a macro, as you have seen here, it's not that complicated at all. But what matters is to be able to edit that macro, is to be able to fine tune that macro, to work that macro. That is, it's where the real skills comes in. It is to understand what the Excel has recorded and also to improve it. You have seen the codes here, and I already gave you an indication of how you can improve it by moving from a certain letter of a certain column to another column, things like that. Now, what does Excel record? Okay, Excel converts your action into VBA codes. That's what it does. But recorded codes has limitations. Okay, recorded codes as limitation. It captures Excel objects like range, cells, worksheet. It often records, how do we say, records unnecessary navigation as well. Step, like you remember the dot select that you saw earlier in the code. I've already closed it. Let me just show you that again. I open it for you. Remember the dot select? So it does certain things that it does according to its way. Okay, the dot select. Now there are other things that it does sometimes called activate, things like that. So not these navigations are not necessarily important. They are all not always needed and can make the code in fact fragile. It often, I will explain to you later, and sometimes you might want not to use a select but to include, but anyway, I'll get to that later. So if it often also, how do we say, um, outcode ranges. For example, if you remember that here I've been doing A to P, for example, but what about if there is an additional column that comes in again and again each time? Are you going to each time modify that code just to fix, just to shoot that situation? That becomes a bit tedious sometimes. So you might have to come up. This is in terms of range, in terms of a column range, but I was talking about a row range, for example. So if each time you have to add additional columns, you have to do the formatting. It becomes a bit tricky. So how that fails if you have new columns, all right? So this is one of the those are the limitations that you have when you are doing these um, recording. Okay, you get these codes, that's good, uh, but recorded macros, they do not think. They do not think. All right. So they just replay the clicks, that's all. There is no decision, no repetition for unknown data set size. There is nothing like that. So, what is our goal? Our goal is to make the macro dynamic. That is, we want the macro to be dynamic. We want a dynamic macro which works for any number of rows, any number of columns, things like that. For that purpose, you will need to add different logic. You will need to add different logic like the if and the loop. All right. So if and repetition logic is not like a loop. Sorry, logic is if and loop is a repetition. All right. So you need to add the logic for if using if, and you will need to add repetition using loop. That's what you have to do. Now, to edit a recorded macro, we need to be comfortable inside the VBA editor, obviously, all right? So now what are we going to do? We are going to look at the VBA editor, okay? I'll just show you what the VB editor looks like and what are the different terms that you are seeing here. I'm going to mention that, okay? So first of all, I open two things together. One, I'm opening a blank book here, and I'm opening the macro, the XLSM that I have been running earlier, and a blank workbook that you have seen here. And I'm going to open the project, the Visual Basic Editor, all right? The VBA editor, all right? So how do I do that? You would recall I do developer and then I click on macro, or there is another one. You can do Alt F11. And when you do Alt F11, you will get the Visual Basic Editor as you are seeing. And then you will see that on the left here, there is what we call the project panel, which is the left panel. And in that project panel, you get quite a number of information with regards to different things. Okay, for example, yeah, I've got two different workbooks open. There is the current workbook that you are working with, and there is the format row header.xlm. So then you have a module one. The module one is where you have the macro being written. Okay, that's basically what it is. Normally, when we refer to the Project Explorer, this shows your workbook, it shows its component, its sheet, and the modules that you are working on. That is the codes that are stored within this particular macro that you can run on your workbook if you want. Now, that procedure here is when we talk about a module, rather, this module is just like a folder or a page where the VBA code lives. For example, here you will see that this is where this code lives in that particular case here, module. You can add a new module. By the way, you can right click here and then you say insert and then insert module. That gives you a new module, and you can write a new macro, whatever you want, by starting by this simple term sub, as I explained to you. Just like you just saw here, when you go in module one, you will see that there is sub format row header, so you will need to come and write sub format row header and so on. But I can remove that module, so I just remove the module, and then it says, do you want to export the module before? No, you say no, because there's nothing there. And then we delete that module and I get back to what I was working. So a module is like a folder, as I mentioned, and it contains your VBA code. And normally when you are recording macros, it will usually go into this module that you are working on. The other thing is that, bon, now, if you want to write it from scratch, obviously you are not going to write a macro. If you're creating a new module, you're not going to necessarily be recording a macro. You might have to write the code on your own, like if you are used to writing the code. But if you're not used to writing the code, as I said to you, it's preferable that you go through the recording of the macro and modify wherever you have to modify and amend wherever you have to amend, obviously. Okay. Now, when we talk about a procedure, you would remember that I was mentioning about a procedure. That is a procedure here. The procedure is a macro. In fact, a macro is just a sub procedure. We call that a sub procedure. And it starts like sub, and then you have your macro, my macro name, and then you have this open bracket, close bracket, and then you would have your content within this, and then you will end the sub. So the macro will always be contained within that sub procedure that you are seeing here. How do you run inside the VB editor? You can just come here and click here, or you will see that there is this F5 that you can use, but it depends. For some of you, you might not be able to type F5 directly, but you might have to do function F5. So then if I come in this, I need to click anywhere within that sub macro, and then I can execute, or I can click here and do F5 on my sorry, let me just come here. You will see that I can do F5 here somewhere, and then it will run it automatically. So you put your cursor somewhere in your sheet, and then you come here and then you do F5. Or you can, as I mentioned to you earlier, you don't need to do all this, but I'm just showing you that you can work through the Visual Basic Editor, and I also explained to you what the Visual Basic Editor is about. Okay, you could do it the way I was explaining to you. You come here and you do Control A. That will create your because I've created the shortcut earlier when I was running the code. But remember that in anything that you are doing, this raw editor, even if it is not side by side like I'm showing here, but it should be open. And if you want, you can minimize it if you wish. But at least this will give you access to the VBE, that is the Visual Basic Editor, where you can execute your macros if you want to execute a macro. Just remember that it has to be open, even if it is not maximized, it is a minimized screen, but it has to be open somewhere so that you can open it in your blank sheet that you're working in, a new Excel file that you're working, so that you get access to it. Okay, so that's a little bit what it is about the visual editor. As I mentioned to you, the procedure is just a sub macro where you have my macro, and you it's a sub procedure, sorry. The macro is just a sub procedure, I mean, and it is something that is written as you are seeing here. Okay, now we can zoom in on the simplest VBA structure. That is a procedure and command. I will just explain to you something that you have seen already. Just a simple thing, a procedure and a command, which does not have any codes or anything. Okay, this is an example of, here you start with sub, you put the name of your macro, you open bracket, you close bracket, you end sub. As soon as you have done that, as you was, just give me a second review. So you will start by this. You will write in your VBA editor. If you want to write a new one, a new macro right now, later, you can start by writing a new macro, as simple as that. By creating a new module, you remember I mentioned to you how you can create a new module. You start by writing sub. It's always been written. It's a keyword. Then you put the name of the macro that you want, whatever name you wish. Yeah, I've said a clean report. It's just a name, whatever your name you want to call it. And then you will open bracket, close bracket, and then you will end sub. That's the first thing, end sub. And then you can start writing whatever you want within these two lines. These two lines. What are these two lines? That is end sub and sub here. Before you write your codes, it's always good that you start by sub. You put the name of the macro, open, close, and sub, and then you write whatever you want. You have just seen an example. Just give me a second with you. I'll open an editor here. You have just seen an example. Sub, format, row, header, and then you will see that there are things that are written inside. But in this example that I'm showing you, I'm not showing you any codes, but I'm showing you commands if you want, okay? I'm showing you comments. Now, here, normally, you will have comments being written as this. All right, this code here, this apostrophe, as rather, this apostrophe is used to represent a comment in VBA. All right, so it usually look like this. I'm just mentioned to you. You start a procedure with a name here. You answer means you stop the procedure. That means you stop the procedure, and anything that have an apostrophe just before it, anything that has an apostrophe before it, VBA will ignore it. It means that it will not execute these codes. These are not codes. It is just comment. Comment means you are writing comment to explain what the code is doing. A bit like what I've just done here. You see, I'm doing a comment. I'm saying this is format row header macro. I could write whatever I want here. This macro, I could say somewhere I can add a new comment here, and then I put apostrophe, and then I say this macro, this macro um, normally formats your header. That's all. And then you put enter and you can delete that. So when you are doing this here, what you are doing is that um, VBA understand that this is not meant to be executed. It's just a command. This macro formats your header. For example, you will see that there is a command that has been automatically added, which is keyboard shortcut, and you did Control A. That gives you an indication of whether you want to execute that code. You can just do Control A in your workbook, and you will get this applied, run. So here, as I mentioned to you, the idea here is that we are just writing commands in this particular macro, the simplest of all macros that you can imagine that you can do is just to write a code with commands. Okay. Normally, you need to understand also something that VBA runs from top to bottom, line by line. So the order of the line matters. That is when you are writing your just give me a second, I'll open it again. When you are writing your codes, not this, excuse me, when you are writing your Visual Basic Editor, bear in mind that everything is run line by line from top to bottom. For example, I can't put range AP1 select down there. That would not work properly. That will say that the macro will not be executed and it will be wrong. So just bear in mind that you have to follow a certain order to run your VBA. So that's a little bit about a simple, very, very, very basic, how do we say, structure, VBA structure. All right, now to understand code, we must understand what VBA is controlling in your Excel. All right, that brings us to the idea of what we call object. Now, we come to the concept of object now. Okay, what is an object? An object is just a thing, I can call it like that in Excel, that a VBA can work with. To make it simple, it's something that in Excel that VBA can work with. You have several examples that exist. You have Excel itself, the application is an object. You have a workbook, you have a worksheet, you have a cell, you have a range of cells. All these are examples of what we call an object. All right. So anything like that, a cell that the VBA can work on with, like becomes an object. All right. A cell or a range of cells that is a range becomes an object. And there is something else that we call properties, all right? For example, cell A1 is an object. Then if you talk about properties, what are properties? Properties are details about the object. For example, a cell's value, the color, the font, size, all these are example of properties of that particular object that you have. And there are methods that you have as well. Some additional key terms I'm talking about. Methods are what? They are actions the object can do. The methods are actions that the object can do. That is, for example, you can clear the content of an object, cell A1, you can delete the content, you can copy the content, you can clear the content. There are different things that you can do. All right. So I give you examples here. Range A1 dot value equal to 25. So range A1 is the object. Sorry, excuse me here. This is the object. Uh, Range A1 is your object that you are seeing. The dot value is the property. This dot value here is the property. That is what is inside this object. What is inside this object is the dot value. So we are talking about the object on one side, then you have dot property, the object and the properties assigned to it. All right. And then, for example, here again, I can ask you what is the object and what is the property. But here there is no property because here you have the object as it is here. This is the object, but when you do dot clear contents, you are not referring to a property, but you are referring to a method. That is an action, which is in our case removing what is inside the cell. Okay, which is in removing what is inside this particular cell. So in this context, you have the object, you have a property with that object that is assigning, you are assigning a value to that object. Here, you are running a method where you are doing an action on that cell, where you are deleting, not deleting, but clearing content rather. And this is a little bit these different terms that exist in VBA that you need to bear in mind. So this is like always, you start with the object, and the object will lead you toward a property and a method, because that is how VBA controls Excel, by the way. That's how it controls Excel. It will control Excel because you have made a reference to an object, and that object has got a property assigned to it or has got a method assigned to it. And that's how it works. So you are telling Excel, go in range A1. In my case, when we talk about range A1, it's just a cell here. It's the range is just a cell, right? Because when you talk about range, generally you have it, you have here something like that, a1, and then you put 2 something, all right, or b2 b3 or whatever. But if you are talking about only a 1, it's a range of a single cell address, that's all. And yeah, we go. This is some key terms that you have: objects, properties, methods, what these means when we talk about object, all right. Now that we can point to objects, we need a way to store information while the macro runs. I've understood a little bit some terms about it. Now we also need to store the information while the macro runs. That's where variables, the concept of variables, come in. When we are referring to a variable normally in VBA is a named storage box, right? Like a named storage box, and we use it to remember a value. Okay, while of course we remember the value normally because we need to reuse it in the next lines, in the next few lines of a code. All right. The most important question that we need to ask ourselves is why not just type the value directly in the code rather than having a variable to use, okay? Because in real Excel files, many values are not known in advance and change every time, especially when it comes to the number of rows. This change quite often, even not only in terms of number of rows, but in terms of number of columns as well. Sometimes these changes. So you might have to adapt your macro to fit new additional data that comes in, for example, at every time. And you need a variable. And when we talk about variable, there are different types of variable. You have integer, long, which represent row numbers. Okay, I'll explain to you what long is. It's a type of whole number, which is not decimal, that can hold very large numbers. All right, integer normally can hold up to integer normally can hold up to about 37,670 32,767, excuse me, 32,767 rows, whereas long can go up to 1 million rows. So if you use integer to store row numbers and your dataset is large, VBA will throw an overflow error. That is, it will mean that the number is too big. That's why we generally define last row as long. We define the data type for, we define the type rather for row to be long rather than a simple integer, because especially if you have a big number of rows. So avoid using integer, but use long for rows. All right. So you will see that there is dim as well, and dim represent dimension. That's how we define a variable in VBA. So we are putting a dimension dim. We say last row as long. As long means you are defining the last row to be an integer that can take values that are very, very big, all right, up to 1 million. That's what it means. Then you have dim I as long. That can be used for loop counter. When I say dim I as long, I normally will store the current row, and the first loop will be I equal to something, which could be with regards to a column, which could be regards to, I can represent a column, I can represent a row, whatever it is. All right. So this is normally what I means, and then you have a status. The status as string. So string here means a text, by the way. Excuse me. String means a text. So when you are saying that dim status as string, so status represent a text that you want to store somewhere. For some reason you want to store a text, you can do so. So that's what it means. Okay. Now, you may ask yourself, but what's the point of having a variable? You may still not get this. Why do I need a variable? And what is this dim work WS as worksheet, WS worksheets row? All right, let me explain that first, and then I'll explain to you again what is the purpose of having um, variables. All right. So when you see something like that, when you see dim ws as worksheet, it means ws is a variable that points to the sheet, to a worksheet, and that worksheet is defined as raw data in my case. So we use set because a worksheet is an object, that is a thing, and not a simple number or a text or value, right? There you see that set is an object. So what happened here is, in this context here, what you have just done here is that you are saying that you have a worksheet that is named raw data, and I'm going to store it in a variable called ws through that set. And when I store it in the WS variable, it means that next time I can use that WS somehow in my macro. And that WS is a worksheet, all right? So we are saying that this WS is not, we are defining this variable as an object in that particular context. The WS variable is a worksheet, okay? This WS is a worksheet. It is not long, it is not string, it is not integer, but it is a worksheet. We can also define that like this. Okay. So here it's like we are not storing a number, but we are storing an Excel thing, an Excel object. We're not storing a number, but we are restoring an object directly. So that's why we use set. You see the difference here is that we're not storing a number, but we are using uh, an object, and that object. This is why we put that keyword set here. We use set because it's an object. Each time you have an object that you need to define something, you need to use set. And for example, what's the purpose of having this defined as WS? Means that if you want to write a code later, you can write a code, for example, WS dot range. For example, you remember A1 dot value, and then you say equal to header. When you do something like that, it means that you are saying that you have defined that first. You have defined these two things first. That is, you say that WS is a worksheet, and that worksheet is raw data. You're defining what this worksheet is, raw data, and you're saying that from the raw data worksheet, go and to the range A1, which is basically a cell address in my particular context here, and replace that value of A1 by this word header. That's what you are doing. All right. Instead of repeating something like that, instead of doing that, let me show you. Instead of having to write this worksheets, excuse me, let me just write it down properly. Instead of writing down worksheets, raw data as you see here, instead of writing down worksheets, raw data, and then you type dot range A1 between inverted comma, inverted comma, dot value is equal to header, as you see down there. And then if you have to work with another worksheet, you get to have to write this again. And especially if this code involves doing that several times, instead of doing that, you have already defined WS, and you can just use WS each and every time. That makes things far simpler to work with. You see, one advantage of using variable already is that you don't need to repeat. Now, the other thing is that if you want to change your sheet, if you have several sheets and you want to change WS to a different sheet, let's suppose you have clean data, you can easily do that. Clean data, your code stays as it is. It's just that now you are running something on the clean data. For example, if you have the same number of rows in the not same number of rows, same number of columns in your clean data, you might have just to change this WS to clean data. WS stays as it is, the code stays as it is. You just run the code on the clean data, it works easily. You see, that's the advantage of having the variable stored rather than having to go in the whole list of codes again and modifying each time where you have worksheet raw data. Let's suppose you have been using worksheet raw data several times in your lines of codes. You would have had to change worksheets raw data to worksheets clean data each and every time. But when you're using a variable, you just do it only once, change raw data to clean data. The rest is using WS. So it has been stored as WS. So in other words, you don't need to change each and every line. So in other words, you're avoiding to do hard coding. The other example that I want to illustrate is here. You have an example of why you want to use variable, because I didn't mention it here, but I'm showing it to you as well. By the way, this is making your macro dynamic rather than static. What do I mean by that? Let's suppose you if you are doing an hard coding means what? For example, you say a range A10 dot value is equal to done. A10 dot value is equal to done, or whatever you want to write here. You are saying that you need to replace the value at A10, at cell A10, cell address A10, by something called gun. Here you are assuming that we know that the last value, the last row is 10, and that's why I will put done or something like that. Just an example. You are putting a value and you say that you assume that it is 10 or you know that it is 10. But sometimes some data, you will see that if you have to go and identify your data, it may that there has been some additional rows, like let's suppose your colleagues have worked on the data, it gives you some additional rows. Now, if there are additional rows, that A10 will be in the middle of those rows. And it won't be good if you put a value that is not supposed to be in the middle, but to be at the end of the row. Then you have a problem. The problem is that this A10 is already fixed. You know that in that cell, in other words, in that cell, we are referring to that cell A10 here. But what about if data continues to A15? If you have data up to A15 and want to replace that by done or something like that, what would you do? You have to be careful. You can't each time do hard coding to change this whenever you have to change the number of rows. You would like that the last row could be stored somehow. So you want to make VBA find the last row and store it in a variable, and then each time you can refer to that particular value and set it as done. How do I do that? Here we go. Normally, you will say last row is equal to cells count dot row, comma a dot end excel up dot row. Okay. So what does this mean? Well, I'm just before we write that, there is something that we missed here. Is that you will need to define the dimension here. We'll say dimension last row as, excuse me, dimension last row as long. When you say dimension last row as long, then last row you know is a variable, and that variable is what? And Excel up means what? If we go there, it means that, sorry, let me just close that. This is a macro. I'll just close that and open this one. So when you say and Excel up means what? Normally, when you have this, you will see that there is this cell rows dot count. What is cell rows dot count? Rows dot count means the maximum row number in Excel. What is the maximum row number in Excel? We go there in that Excel, we go down and down. You can type END and then the down arrow. You will know that is what is the maximum number of rows that Excel can contain. It is 1,048,576. So what happened is that it says that cell rows dot count A, but for me it's not A, for me it's I in my context here. So the cell at the bottom of column I, for me it's not A, because I've already started it from I here, I'll stick to I. So for me, I will say the cell at the bottom of column I, cell rows dot count means what? Cell rows dot count means there, this part, in my example, excuse me, in my example, that thing would mean cell rows that count 1 million something, comma, I, because I've just changed it to I, because I've started the example of I, so I'll stick to I. But it depends if you're working with the first column, you will put A. So for me, it's the sum of 1 million something I. That is the sum, the cell that is at the bottom of column I. That's what it means. So rows that count into maximum, and when you do maximum I, it means that you are referring to a particular cell somewhere in your, let me open the workbook. So you are referring to the column cells I, cell 10, 1 million, I is this cell here. And what is in the code, you will see that there is dot n xlr. So what does it mean? It means that you count how many rows total you have in Excel, go to that particular cell at the bottom completely of that particular column, A in this example, but I in my example, and then apply this function nxlookup. Nxlookup means what? Nxlookup means you are going upwards to the first non-empty cell that you have. It means that you are going up to the first non-empty cell. It's like doing control plus the up arrow. I repeat, doing control plus the up arrow. Look what's going to happen. When you do control plus the up arrow, you go to the first non-empty cell. There are other empty cell above, but when you do control up, you go to the first non-empty cell. So the procedure is simple. What I just did here is that we said go to the last row, basically go to this cell address. This cell address is cell 1 million something, column A. In my case it's column I. Do this manipulation of n xlr means what? Control. It's like doing control control up arrow, and then you do dot row. Dot row means take the row number of that particular cell. The row number of that particular cell is 15. So that's what it is. So in other words, what happened here is that when I say last row equal to cell row dot count a and xlr dot row, where row represent the number of that particular cell when I have done this procedure of end xlr, is going to give me a value of 15. So in other words, I know that my last row is 15. As simple as that. And I can use that in my forthcoming VBA codes if I want, without any problem. I can use that as much as I want in my VBA code later. The advantage with that is that there is no hard coding. For example, you will see that I can use that to do something else. For example, if I know what is the last row, I can from here last row dim last row as long last row. After I've written that, I can come here and do cells, for example last row, and then I put, let's suppose, B or A or I dot value equal to, not I, but for me it's going to be J in my example. Let's put it as J. ij, next to it I put the value done. I not replace I itself, but I put a value next to the last value in I in the next column, j, and then done. So in other words, what this will do is that it will put a value here just next to this, and it will call it done. So something like that, you see. Here you can play around with that. You can write whatever number of code. The advantage here is that you don't have to determine the last row yourself, but you let Excel determine it yourself by making the code dynamic. You see the importance of a variable, by the way. The variable is important because you're recording the last row you're in the workbook, and that last row is going to be used for other purposes, like to write something done in the next cell, which is in the next column, things like that. So that's the advantage of making macros dynamic, so that you don't have to do it yourself. So that's the code, by the way, that you can run several times yourself, and I guess that is a code that you might be using quite often, by the way. You can start getting used to that code, because I believe that you might use that code quite a lot of time if you are doing some manipulation in Excel. It makes your life far easy when you have to determine the last row of a data. Just for information, generally, for this um, A, you will see that it's preferable that you stick to A as far as possible. All right, because we assume that the first column of data will generally have data present. Okay, but if it does not, then you might have to shift to a different. Like in my case, I had to shift to I. If this was the case, But generally, the first column is going to represent what we call an identifier usually. So now let's use that last row variable to do something to every row. All right, that requires that basically will require a loop. Now, when we talk about a loop means what? A loop means that you are going to repeat a code. All right. The most common beginner loop is for I equal to 2 to last row. Do something on row I. Next I. This is how you are going to write a loop in VBA. Now, this do something is a different issue here. I'm not going to discuss that right now. We'll discuss it later. But this means what? This means in plain language to start at I equal to at I start I at 2 rather. Start I at 2, which is usually row 1. All right, not row 1 but usually row 2, because row 2 is not the header in the data. Normally, generally, when you are doing something, you can say I is equal to 2 means don't take the header, which is row 1, and do whatever you have to do afterward. Okay, like do a manipulation, add a value, subtract a value within all the values that you have from the second row onward. And then you can go down to last row means what? You go down row by row until you reach last row. So for I is equal to 2, that is for the second row in the data, we are skipping the header here. From the second row, go to the last row, that is go down row by row until the last row. Now, run the code inside. I did not show you any code inside, but I'm just mentioning it. Run whatever code. For example, you can just say add values to the different cells value that you have, or different cell value that you have. Add to these values, things like that. And then stop when you reach the end. Stop when you reach the end. So next I means you are going to do that for the first, for example, a sum that you want to do, or an addition. Then move to the next I, which is 3. I is equal to 3, I is equal to 4, I is equal to 5, up to the last row that you have in the data. And the last row, you would recall, we would have defined it as dim last row as long, and we will obtain the last row through that code. You see how we can do things here with that simple variable that we have defined. We can do that. Why normally loop matters? You can basically compute a formula for every row, as I mentioned to you. You can check a rule for every row. You can fill missing values row by row, for example. There are quite a number of things that you can do. Okay, so there are other examples that I gave you here of why loops are important. Basically, you are just repeating an action. Now we are going to combine everything into a realistic task. Instead of doing 20 clicks every time, we create one macro that does the whole pipeline. All right. And how do we do that? So instead of repeating it every time, we do a single macro that repeats that will do the whole pipeline. Now, this is where you automate a repetitive task. How do you go about it? This is an example workflow we want Excel to perform automatically. All right, it's an example. It's not something that you have to do for every data. I'm just giving you an example here. You start by copying raw data. You clean the data. You remove duplicate using invoice ID, for example. You fill missing region, you compute revenue by doing quantity times unit price, you create summary, month times region totals, and then you apply basic formatting. This is an example of a workflow where you might want VBA to come in, where you might want your macro to work here, because this will be a repetitive task generally that you want to do, maybe with additional rows that will come each and every time, but generally the task stays the same each and every time. So you don't want to do your formatting with regards to a new data that comes each and every time. You don't want to repeat your formatting. You don't want to drag the column of the formula that you have computed in a column. You don't want to drag it for new months or new dates that is what you are getting in the data. You want to automate the task automatically without having to do all these stuff again and again. You don't want to remove duplicate each time. You don't want to fill missing region each time. You don't want to do all these stuff each time. So then you can run a macro for that. We might record parts of this, but we usually must edit the macros so that it becomes dynamic and reliable, obviously. And editing the macro will involve creating things like dim last row as long, setting your last row, and then from the last row, we will be able to do all these things. Of course, I'm not going to explain how you should do all this now, but let's look at the practical strategy of how you can automate your macro. First of all, you will start by recording a basic macro doing the step ones, but then you will have to edit the code. If you want to do this, for example, you might want to do it through the recording of the macro. Then you will have to update this recording so that it is updatable each time you are working with an updated data, all right? So, in other words, you will edit the macro by removing select or activate. What do I mean by select or activate? Let me show you this example here. You will see that there is select here, range A1 to P1 select. You will remember that I've been highlighting my first row from A1 to P1 and then done select. But this is under the assumption that you are dealing with a 1 to P1 each time. But what about if you have additional columns? What about if you have additional rows in your data and so on? That is not the way to go ahead with that. So select and there is also something that we call activate that comes in. It's not there here, but select and activate, they are recorded because Excel is copying what you do with mouse or your keyboard. You click a cell, it select. You click a sheet, it activate. Then you apply your formatting. All right. So in VBA, you usually want to remove them because they make macros fragile and slower. So for example, a select what it does is that it highlight a particular group of range. For example, if I do range uh, A1 to P1, as I've been explaining to you, range A1 to P1 between inverted comma, obviously, and then I do select. What it is doing is that it is selecting, it is highlighting that range of that range of data. For example, here it is doing that A1 to P1. That's what it does. Activate makes this workbook the one on the screen. That is sheet one, sheet two, whatever it is. All right. So you will normally have something like that. Worksheet, um, raw data. Let's suppose your worksheet is called raw data, but it depends. It could be something else. And then you say dot activate. All right. Things like that. That's what it does. So normally when you do select, it's like selecting a range, but activate means you are working with a particular worksheet. That is, it activates that worksheet. And you might want to remove that because not always do you want to work within a particular worksheet called raw data. Okay. So why removing them in fact is better, like why you want to remove this select or activate if ever they exist in your code. Normally they depend on what is currently on the screen. That's why it is dependent on what you have in your screen. If a macro expects something to be selected but it isn't, the macro can fail or affect the wrong place. All right. So this works only if the correct range is selected. When you are applying A1 to P1, it will work only if that data is within that scope of A1 to P1. But if the data goes beyond the A1 to P1, as I mentioned to you, then it becomes a problem. So this is important. They can format the wrong workbook sheet as well, because if you apply that same macros on a different workbook sheet, let's suppose you have a new sheet, but you have data for only these four rows, these five columns. You have data only for these five columns, not up to P, and you want to highlight, to bold, to freeze these only five, not freeze, but highlight, bold these five first column. Then what would happen is that if you are applying this macro, it will go up to P. It will not only be this column. So it depends on what you have on the screen, and you have to be careful. And it is here you can format the wrong workbook or the wrong sheet, right? And the other thing is that they tend to be slower. All right, it tend to be slower means it takes you extra steps. Selecting and activating changes the Excel interface repeatedly, which normally slows macro down and cause screen flickering. Sometimes it depends, but maybe when you're working with large data that you will see that, but right now maybe you won't find that problem. So I would suggest to you that you remove that thing that we call select and activate wherever you find this in your worksheet. For example, like here, you will see that there is select. You would want to remove that in your worksheet. And if there is worksheet dot activate, I would also recommend that you remove that worksheet, whatever dot activate as far as possible. Okay. So here we go. The next thing is, let me get there. So the next thing that I want to talk about is a simple example of a macro. Here you have a clean report that we want to produce, similar to the example that I gave you earlier, pertaining to this example, all right, where I was mentioning similar to that, not exactly this, but something a little bit about that. So what we want to do here is to create a macro, and to create a macro that produce a clean report. So what is all this about? Let's start first of all. You recall that I told you earlier that sub is a macro that you are running, and you end sub means you end that macro. And this macro that you are running will be named as something. So clean report is normally the name of the macro. And when you type sub clean report here, when you type sub clean report, what you are doing here is that this is starting a macro named clean report. And then you have dim last row as long. That is creating a variable called last row, and that variable last row is used to store the last data row number. And then you have dim I as long. This is creating creating a variable called creating a variable called I that will move through the rows in a loop. That's the idea. And then you have last row cell rows dot count a and xlf row that I've been mentioning a little bit earlier, is that this is going to the bottom of column A. This is going to the bottom of column A and moving upward through the n xlf to find the last filled row. Last filled row means the last non-empty row. And then you have cell 1f dot value total. What does it mean? It means that it will put the header word total in cell F1. You see, it put the header total in cell F1. And then when this is done, when you have put the header in the first a row of column F, our next step is this loop. Now, what's happening here is that for I is equal to 2 to last row up to next I, you are repeating the next action for every row from row 2 down to the last row that you have, down to the last row. That is, the last row is what you have defined as variable earlier. If the last row is 10,000, so it will move that step up to 10,000. It will repeat that step. That step is means this, the content of the for loop. And then this, what I've just underlined here, cell if dot value, cell I dot d dot value times cell I e dot value is means that on row I compute the total. That is, the total is obtained by taking the quantity that exists in column D, that is the value that you will have in column D, multiplied by the value that you got in column E, which could be representing unit price, for example. So you want to column D represent D and E represent the unit price. So you are taking the quantity from cell I, that is row 2, that is cell 2D, cell 2D for those who are not really getting it, I mean something like that. Cell 2D means the row 2 and column D, that is it start from here. You see, it is going to do the computation from here. Cell to D value, that is a quantity that, based on what I just mentioned here. So it will take that quantity and it will multiply it by the unit price that is found in E, in cell E, in cell IE, that is row 2, column E. That's what it will do. Okay, the value that you have there. So, and it will store it in column F, that is, it will store it in column F2. And what does this procedure says? This is for I is equal to 2, but now you are going to do it for I is equal to 3. That is, it will take this value here, it multiply by this value, and you get a value here. And it will go on, go on, go on, and it will repeat that process again. It will repeat that process here again and again and again and again until the last row is reached. That's what this is doing here. Okay, so that's what is going on. And then you have flag I totals. So here what is happening here is that you are putting the header word flag. Because why we refer to it as a header? Because in column J you will have a number 1. Column J means 1 means there, means the first row. Column 1 means the first row where you have a header, and then you will put a value. The value you are assigning it as flag. So in other words, V macro will type flag here. Okay, that's what it will do. And then as soon as this is done, we repeat the same procedure of a for loop. All right, now we are writing a second loop, that is for each row, based on what you are seeing here. For each row, again I is equal to 1 up to the last row. For each row, if the total, you see, within the first row, if this f, all right, if this f dot value that you have computed by multiplying these two rows here, if f dot value is greater than 5,000, then what you do is that you say that cell 2g, cell 2g is going to be tagged as I. If the value is, let's suppose, 6,000, then it will be tagged as I. All right, else you see that within that for loop itself, else if the value is not greater than or equal to 5,000, let's suppose 2,000, then you will say that this value is okay. And that's what I'm doing here. You type okay. That's the way you write it down. It's not that complicated when you think about it. So you are just filling in a set of values. Again, it will start from y I is equal to 1 up to the last row. Again, this will be repeated. This flagging will repeat until you get the last row that you have in your data. All right, and then you will need to end the if procedure, that is this this logical information here. You need to end this here, and then when this is end, so you see, then you end I. When you say next I, and then you end the whole macro to complete everything. So next I does not come before the end if. So it's the if statement that is running within that for loop. And then you are going to do that for cell 1. It is doing it. Then it will do repeat the same thing for cell 2, repeat the same thing for cell 3, etc. That is the next I, and it goes on until the last row. That is a little bit how you can write a simple macro to compute the total for a certain quantity and unit price within a data set if the total, if a quantity and unit price is found in column D. Okay, then you can compute it in column F. So maybe in column A you would have the food, not food, but you will have different items in column A, or an ID or something like that in column A up to the others. So by the way, if column D or E contains blank, then there is another issue. You would have zeros that would be computed. It may produce zero or even an error if there is no data there, and that might be an issue. So later what we can do is that we can add checks for missing values if needed and fill in these missing values before we do our computation here. But bear in mind that even if you have written a good code like this, it may happen sometime that this fails, especially if you are running it for the first time. You might have written a very good code, but nevertheless, you might have some failure. So you need some sort of debugging routine that will help you to identify where that, why this is the case, what could have happened, etc. So the debugging checklist that I give you here is when your macro fails, you should not panic. You should just follow a checklist that I'm showing you here. So first of all, you read the error message. That's the first step. You read the error message. That's our first step. Excel will normally highlight the line in yellow in the VBA editor. That's usually where the issue is, by the way. Okay, if you run a code in Excel in VBA, you will find the error based on what it is showing you by highlighting it in yellow. And then the second thing is that you can check sheet names. Sometimes code doesn't run well because you wrongly wrote raw data. Maybe you wrote the sheet name is called, for example, sheet 2, but you wrote it as sheet with a space 2, things like that. Then it won't work. So you have to check for the sheet name correctly, and it must be spelled exactly the same way that you have it defined in your worksheet. And then you need to check the last row logic. Use column A and XLR. Make sure that the make sure the column you are using, often it is A, truly has data all the way down and you don't have missing in between, or you don't have you have some issues in between. Ensure that this column A is, for example, an identifier that contains all the information that you need. Now you have also the debug.print. What is this debug.print? Normally, let's suppose you recall here that we have done something like that, where we have done last row equal to cell count, etc. You could just type something like that, debug.print, if there is an issue, obviously, last row. When you do that, what it will do is that, let's suppose you were expecting that the last row should be 200 rows. All right, but when you are using that, it will print a message. Where would that print a message, by the way? Uh, Let me just open the editor if I got it there. Yes. So you will see that there is an immediate window down there that we call an immediate window. It will print a message here telling you what is the last row that is filled. Let's suppose you were expecting 200, but you get 5, you get 7, or whatever it is. Then that would indicate. By the way, if you don't see this view immediate window, you can click on view and you click on immediate window. You will see it appears there, just for information, if ever you don't see that. Okay. So it helps us a lot when we are using that debug.print. All right. Um, Now, the other thing is, let me get back to this. There is step through with F8 to see what changes each line make. This F8 lets you run your macro one line at a time. VBA will pause before each line and show you exactly which line is about to run. So that's what it does. So you normally, to be able to do that, you will need to click inside your macro. You click inside your macro, and inside the sub n you do F8 or you do function F8, and what you will see is normally a yellow highlight shows the next line that is to be run. Each time you press F8 again, FVBA runs that line and moves the yellow highlight to the next line. To better understand the debug this F8 function that is stepping, what I would have done here is that I've created a small um, data like this 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 and then I've opened Visual Basic directly and added a module here by creating insert module directly. And when I add a module here, I repeat, I did not go through the recording step of a macro, but I right click here and I inserted a module directly, and I call that module sub test step. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is to show you how that test step works. That macro, if you read it well, it is basically creating a variable called last row. And this last row is obtained the same way as I have been explaining. I guess you would get used to that by now. Then it identifies the last row in a certain um, in column A, and then it will replace column B with the last row with a value equal to done. So in other words, we expect that when we will execute that macro, that cell here should be replaced by done. Okay, so let's just execute that macro for a moment. So we will execute that macro, and let me just reduce that a little bit so that we can see what's going on. I like to see the macro running at the same time. You can just bring that. Just give me a second with you. There we go. I like to see it running while I'm running the macro at the same time. It's very satisfying to see these kinds of things, especially when you are running macro and you are seeing the worksheet all together moving around and so on. That's very nice. But let's move that. So I'll click here anywhere, and then I can just execute it by clicking on run or F5, as I mentioned to you earlier, and we'll see what happens. You see, as soon as I click play, it clicked down here. Now, to better understand the step through, I will just delete that done and show you step by step what's going on. So what I will do is that I will do Alt F8 here by clicking somewhere here. And I will do Alt F8, not Alt F8, sorry, Function F8 rather, or F8 simply. And then you will see that it highlights yellow. You have an highlighted yellow here. This yellow highlight shows you what? It shows you the next code that is to be run. So we are starting. When you do F8 again, it means that it would run that first line of code. All right, but there's nothing that will happen, obviously, when you do that. So, but then when you have done F8, you have just run test step. But now the next line of code that is to be run is last row. Again, this last row there will nothing visible that will appear here because it's just storing a variable name. And if you do F8 again, you will see that now there is, by the way, for the last row, I forgot to show you something. You could click on local window, all right, and then you will see the last row appearing here. So normally this would not be the case if, as long as you did not complete that step, okay? So the last row you will get, if you click on window local, you will see that the last row stored value is 7, and you can check that, by the way. So here you have this yellow thing here, highlight, which shows that it is the next code to be run. So if I type F8, it means that this is the one that is going to run now. And the next one to be run would be nsub, for example. So when I'm going to type F8 now, because this was highlighted, meaning this is the next one to be run, when I do F8, if I do that, if I execute that now, it means that I will expect to get a value done here. Let's have a look. F8, and you get the value done. And then you can answer, it doesn't matter now from now. But the advantage is that when you have a lengthy piece of code, instead of doing your F5 and executing everything all at once, if ever there are any issues in the macro that it is not working as you expected, then you can do this stepping through to see where there might have been an error by going line by line, little by little, to see where an issue could be identified. Okay, and then you can solve for that issue. Maybe it's a, you I don't know, maybe it's a mistake where you should not have put done, or you should have put something else, or it's returning a different value, or it's returning let's suppose you are doing a computation where you are dividing two cell, for example, and you are getting a zero, for example, things like that. It will return an issue when it comes to that step. So stepping through is important because it helps you to go slowly. All right. Mm, that's it for how you can debug, check if ever you have done some mistake. The next step is what are these common mistakes and fixes for when you're running macro. Macros may not run because the file has been saved as xlsx instead of xlsm. You remember? So normally all your macro is disabled. Sometimes you get Excel sheet and then it says you need to enable macro. So it happens that indeed sometimes you have to enable macros so that the worksheet, so that the Excel works properly and you get a good um, analysis or whatever. Now here you need to save your Excel sheet as XLSM rather than XLSX. You need to save it as XLSM. That enables macros only for trusted files. Then you other issues that you have, mistake that often happen when you are using VBA is that you do hard coding. All right. Uh, Normally, like you remember, you select A1 instead of doing the last row principle and XLUp. All right. Use in that case last row and XLUp, things like that, and loops to be able to work instead, to get a dynamic macro rather than a hard-coded ranges that you have to change each time the data is added to the Excel sheet. And then the other issue is that there are too many select or activate. So uh, normally the cause, not the cause, but it's not something that um, you would want to have, because I explained that a little bit extensively earlier. What you want is that you need to remove them wherever possible rather than having select or active everywhere. It is preferable to have your worksheet name defined as a variable, like the object, which is your worksheet to be defined rather than having the select activate each time. The other thing that you have is wrong column letters or numbers. Sometimes you are using the wrong column letters or numbers. So you need to confirm the worksheet structure before coding anything. And then you have runtime error on empty cells. What does this mean? So often this happen because calculations assume every cell has a value. So then The issue is that whenever you have blanks in your calculations, you need to add missing checks. That is, things like is empty. You need to add things like is empty. You need to add things like trim. You need to add things like is error before you even do your computing. Here we go. That was a little bit a common mistake. Now we can have a look at what you will do on your own. There is a task that I'm going to ask you to do, and I will send you the worksheet, and I would expect you to go through and try it on your own. And of course, I will provide you the solution to that worksheet afterward. And if ever you have any problem, you can meet me in the class and let me know if there is anything that is not working. So what you would do is that you will record a macro for a simple repetitive formatting task. You will locate. You will normally here is that, for example, you will format the header, row, bold, field, color, alignment, all these things, and then here you will locate and understand recorded macros in the VB editor. That is, you will find the sub procedure and identify where the actions are, and then you will update the macro with VBA building blocks, like using adding variables like last row, I, things like that. Add a loop for I is equal to 2 to the last row. Add a if statement to flag values or fill missing data. Build a simple output like month times region summary. All these are things that you are going to do in this lab exercise, the worksheet that I'm going to do. Okay. Finally, let's close with what you must remember to do before submitting or sharing any macro workbook. To wrap up, you need to save your work as .xlsm, so the macro is kept. You need to test properly, that is, you need to clear results like total or flag columns. You need to rerun the macro to confirm it produces the same correct output, and your macro should handle different data set sizes because it uses dynamic last row, for example. Here we go. And the next is to build this small automation workflow that you will do in the lab, obviously. Thank you for your attention.